I always feel mesmerized and paralyzed by the countless choices on drive-through menus. Then a voice from nowhere startles me and asks what I want to order. Much to the chagrin of the drivers behind me, I say, give me a minute. One of the dangers of the spiritual life is to see life as a giant menu where we can make endless choices. In reality, our oversampling of choices that do not lead us closer to God points to our indecision, not our freedom. St. Pope John Paul II said, "Your life is not an endless series of open doors. Listen to your heart. Do not stay on the surface, but go to the heart of things. And when the time is right, have the courage to decide. The Lord is waiting for you to put your freedom in His good hands." And this is St. Paul's point today, that we must make a choice for Christ. In our second reading, St. Paul introduced himself to the church in Rome, which he had not yet met. His greeting begins, "Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God." The first word that catches our attention is the word slave. It obviously has a negative connotation in our country. But Paul thought of himself as Christ's possession, because Jesus had loved him first and died for him. Therefore, Paul belonged no longer to himself, but entirely to Jesus. He later wrote to the Galatians, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." Being a slave of Jesus Christ does not mean that he has dominated us, but rather we have surrendered to Christ. In the Old Testament, the word slave has another meaning. Both Moses and Joshua described themselves as slaves of God. In fact, slave was the highest title of the prophets, because they spoke and acted on behalf of God. Therefore, being a slave of Jesus Christ describes our twofold obligation, to love Christ in return and to be His messenger. Paul also introduced himself as an apostle. An apostle means one who is sent. Jesus told his disciples, "You did not choose me, but I chose you." Being an apostle and slave means that our life is not about us. When we realize that our life is not about us, then we are ready for mission. The word mass reminds us of this, for it comes from the Latin word missa, meaning sent. Bishop Robert Barron loves to say, "Your life is not about you." Jesus told Peter something similar. "When you were younger, you used to dress yourself and go where you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." In other words, when we were immature in the spiritual life, we made our own choices and charted our own path. When a mature Christian takes their lead from Jesus, who always walks the way of the cross. Lastly, Paul wrote that he was set apart for the gospel of God. Paul is hinting at the idea of predestination, which means that God has a plan or mission in mind for each one of us. He wrote to the Ephesians, "God chose us before the foundation of the world to be holy," meaning set apart, "and without blemish." Our vocation is to discern the destiny that God has in mind for us, but He doesn't force us to accept it. Would Paul's life have been easier if he had not accepted God's mission to spread the gospel to the known world? Absolutely. But Paul would never have reached his full potential, nor come to know Christ. Why do we want to be a slave of Jesus Christ? Being a slave of Jesus does not limit our freedom. Rather, the biblical understanding of freedom is that we have the opportunity to say yes to God's choice and God's direction, like Paul, Mary, and Joseph demonstrate for us this Advent. Only in following His route can we discover true happiness and accomplish greater things. Being a slave of Jesus means that we are radically converted and are no longer plagued by the endless choices in this world. Christ came to this earth on Christmas so that we could see only one clear choice. For the spiritual writer and Trappist monk Thomas Merton said, "All the good that you will do will come not from you, but from the fact that you have allowed yourself to be used by God's love.